calls that we've been seeing over the course of today for a ceasefire, unfortunately, seem to fall unilaterally on Israel and deprive Hamas of agency and of responsibility. What we're seeing in terms of the debate in Parliament also is requiring Israel essentially to cease its self-defense and its efforts to return the hostages. 134 hostages remain in Hamas captivity, with reports of torture, rape, and other forms of violence being meted out against them, as well as starvation and the deprivation of medical attention. And Israel has been clear in its aims from the start of this war that it intends to destroy Hamas and its capability to ever conduct anything like the 7th of October again, and to return the hostages. What's interesting is that, for the most part, the international community was signed on to those aims until now. And this about face is inexplicable, because the ability to complete those aims, return the hostages and destroy Hamas, would never have been possible without the final Hamas stronghold in Rafah being subject to this military operation. And so this is a big change in policy, and the reasons for it have certainly not been coherent.
How fair is it to say that there is a double standard when it comes to Israel whenever its military response to a terror attack like the Hamas massacres of October 7th that isn't applied to any other army?
What we've seen is unfortunately far worse than a double standard. We have seen in the course of this debate blood libels and complete falsehoods being levelled against Israel, and in particular its military operation in Gaza. Untruths being told not only about the way that Israel is prosecuting this operation against Hamas, but also about the application of international law and international humanitarian law, specifically allegations of war crimes, which have absolutely no basis in the reality, in the facts, or the law. The fact of the matter is that those military and legal experts with an insight into Israel's past military operations in Gaza, as well as an understanding of Israel's operations now, have been consistently clear that, in fact, Israel goes well above the requirements of international law in the precautions that it takes against civilian collateral damage, and in targeting its strikes and providing warnings of those strikes. So much so that it's been called the most moral army in the history of warfare. Now, that is completely at odds with what we have heard, with unfounded and untrue allegations of Israel targeting Palestinian civilians, and repeated references to casualty figures that are put out by the Hamas terrorist group through its control of the health authorities in Gaza. Now, the casualty figures that have been relied upon in the course of this debate are missing some important pieces of information. The first is any form of independent investigation. Because the Hamas figures themselves cannot be taken as a given. We have multiple examples of clear inflation and fabrication. The second aspect of the problems with these figures is that they make no distinction between civilians and combatants. And indeed, we've seen many parliamentarians referring to them in the course of this debate as though they were all civilian casualties. Now, Israel has been clear that the number of terrorists it knows to have eliminated is approaching 12,000. What we simply don't know is how many in total are members of Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or even perhaps ordinary civilians taking part in hostilities, in taking up arms, and therefore becoming legitimate military targets themselves. That we certainly don't know. The other aspect of this information, which is not something that Hamas is putting out, is how these people it claims have died came about to became deceased, because we do know that Hamas are targeting their own civilians in Gaza, that they have been shooting them, that they have been bombing fleeing civilians, convoys, following the paths of the humanitarian corridors that Israel has sought to protect and defend. That is Hamas direct fire. Only in the last couple of days, the protests that we have seen erupting against Hamas in the Gaza Strip by ordinary Palestinian civilians, those have also been targeted by direct live fire. And the other manner in which Hamas has been killing its own civilians is with rockets fired by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad that frequently fall short in the Gaza Strip. And we've seen examples of this famously in the context of the Al Aqli Hospital car park on the 17th of October. But there are very many rockets that are targeting Israeli civilians that in fact fall short in the Gaza Strip that have also been killing civilians. All of this, of course, all of this important context and the responsibility of Hamas was wholly absent from the debate for the most part. And the vast majority of parliamentarians had simply attributed all of the deaths to Israel's actions of self-defense. And that is not correct on the basis of what we know about the facts on the ground. It stems from repeated blood libels, allegations of ethnic cleansing, now even of genocide, which are an inversion of reality when we consider that the real genocide was perpetrated by Hamas, acts of genocide against Jews on the 7th of October, and that when we also consider, of course, that Hamas has threatened to do this again and again. And we've seen an inversion of reality and continual unfounded blame being put on Israel. That has been the cornerstone of so very many of the speeches calling for the ceasefire in this debate. An immediate ceasefire would, of course, leave the 134 hostages in Hamas captivity. And it's clear from the hostages that Israel was able to release through its negotiations that it was only military pressure on Hamas that facilitated that humanitarian pause, which was then very quickly violated by Hamas when it suddenly refused to return the remaining female hostages and then began to fire upon Israel. So when we think about how the previous exchange was facilitated, how the previous extraction return of hostages was facilitated, and we think about the prospects of the future release of hostages, what this debate and what calls for this ceasefire are doing are encouraging Hamas to keep going and encouraging Hamas to continue its attack on Israel and to refrain from realistic negotiations and the return of the hostages. They also, these calls for a ceasefire, do an enormous wrong to the Palestinian people because they suggest, these parliamentarians that have been issuing this call, that Hamas should remain. And Hamas should remain in a position not only where it continues to threaten Israel and repeats its desire to commit the atrocities of the 7th of October over and over again, but where it continues to oppress, torture, and abuse and neglect its own civilians in the Gaza Strip. And the Palestinians in Gaza deserve better than that. They deserve the support of the international community to rid them and Israel of Hamas once and for all. We've seen the result of previous ceasefires essentially imposed by pressure from the international community, all the way from 2008 through, of course, in 2014, in 2021. On each of these occasions, Hamas has used the opportunity to expand its terror network and infrastructure and rearm in order to continue to pose what it hopes is an existential threat to Israel. It has been clear about its intentions here. And what the international community and members of parliament in the United Kingdom really need to understand is that by continuing to support Hamas in its efforts to avoid its destruction, they are simply taking us back to a situation where this cycle will continue over and over again. The only hope for the peace that they profess is to ensure that Hamas is eradicated, to ensure that it can no longer govern the Gaza Strip. And in keeping with that, we've heard references to a Marshall Plan for Gaza in the course of the debate in Parliament. It's important to note, of course, that the Marshall Plan was set in motion in parallel with a program of denazification. And when we consider the real cause of not just the atrocities of the 7th of October, but all of the terrorism that Israeli civilians have suffered under for decades, this has been the result of programs of indoctrination, which have been funded by international taxpayers and supported by United Nations organizations. 3,000 terrorists crossed the border on the 7th of October, and according to UN statistics, about 3/4 of them would have been educated in UN-run schools under the UNRWA system and the Palestinian Authority curriculum. And it is through this indoctrination from kindergarten onwards that we have seen an unrelenting support for the program that Hamas has put forward for slaughter of Jews and for the attempted annihilation and continued acts of genocide against Jews. The fact that this has been absent from the discussion and that instead this tick box scenario of calling for a ceasefire that would leave this indoctrination and this terror and this oppression of the Palestinian people themselves in place is extremely revealing. It shows that what we have seen on display is a great deal of ignorance and arrogance. And I've also seen certain discussions talking about it in the context of a colonialist imperialist attitude. The notion that the Palace of Westminster would be able to educate those in the region as to what the real issues are and the proper and appropriate paths to peace, that certainly isn't going down very well amongst those that truly understand what Hamas is about and what Iran's terror proxies are seeking to achieve. When I say that they are playing into the hands of the terrorist organization Hamas, the international clamor that is now seeking to prevent Israel from pursuing its lawful rights of self-defense and conducting this military operation in accordance with international law, calls that are seeking to put pressure on Israel to desist, serving the interests of Hamas because they are enabling the Hamas leadership to seek to survive, to fight another day. And that is surely the major fashion in which the conflict, and in particular the suffering of the people in the Gaza Strip, will be perpetuated.
And what's your message to UK politicians?
Ultimately, it has to be that this is not simply Israel's fight alone. Hamas, Hezbollah, as proxies of ISIS, see Israel as the first enemy on a very long battle against the West. The West is next is a phrase that has certainly garnered currency in recent weeks. It may sound trite, but it is extremely important to understand that the approach and the aims of these Islamist fundamentalist terrorists are contrary to all values of freedom and democracy and Western liberal democratic values. And that has been the key element of the oppression also of the Palestinian people and the inability of proper representative liberal government to flourish in the territories that are controlled both by Hamas but also by the Palestinian Authority.